I used to be a brilliant surgeon. But that's just a title, nothing more. I turned my back on what truly mattered and ran away like a coward. Is there a doctor here, anyone? A desperate mother called out, pleading for help for her daughter who had collapsed. There's nothing I can do as a doctor anymore. After all, a young doctor named James is already handling the situation, so I decided to stay out of it. But then, something unexpected happened. Why isn't the needle working? At this rate, the girl's life is in danger. I stood up reluctantly and said something far from what you'd expect from a doctor. Can someone lend me a pen? My name is Eric. I just turned 48 this year. I don't have a life partner. By choice, I remained single, and before I knew it, I was nearing my 50s. My life has been nothing but work. I worked tirelessly, barely stopping to rest, sacrificing even sleep, until I was completely burned out. I just wanted to go home. And the next thing I knew, I was on a plane headed back to Japan. That's when I encountered something unexpected. Please, someone, help! It felt like the first time in ages that I'd heard Japanese. I was on a flight that had just left an airport in Northern Europe. Although just left wasn't quite accurate, since the flight had already been going for over 6 hours. The once quiet cabin was suddenly filled with tension, and the staff were rushing around frantically. I closed my eyes slowly. I used to be called a genius surgeon. It's not something I'd say about myself, but it's the truth. I'm Japanese, born and raised in Japan. I grew up in a poor household, and my mother worked tirelessly so I wouldn't have to suffer. My father wasn't around. I don't even have a memory of him, and my mother never once talked about him, so I just assumed he wasn't worth much. Whenever I showed the slightest interest in something, my mother would respond enthusiastically and try to nurture that curiosity. Why do stars shine? Apparently, I asked her that when I was 4 years old. I also wondered why the Earth, though round and spinning, doesn't cause us to fall off, or why the sun and moon are rarely visible at the same time. I was a kid full of questions. Seeing that, my mother decided I was destined for a career in science and bought me all kinds of books and encyclopedias. I was absolutely fascinated by those encyclopedias, and from elementary through middle school, I was especially good at science and math. In high school, I chose the science and math track at the local public school, and since I came from a low-income household, most of my tuition was waived. Naturally, I aimed for medical school and got accepted on my first try. From there, everything seemed to fall into place. Getting into medical school wasn't the goal, it was just the beginning. There were plenty of tough moments, especially during hands-on training, but I persevered thanks to my mother. However, soon after I started working as a resident, my mother passed away from illness, likely worn down by years of hard work. I want to save people who are suffering from illness, just like my mother. With that single-minded determination, I chose to specialize in surgery, despite its reputation for being grueling. But the reality was harsh. No. This patient has been under my care for a long time. Why? Injustice has always tormented me. I was removed from a surgery I was supposed to perform simply because the patient was assigned to Dr. Taylor's son, the hospital director's heir. And this son, with little surgical experience, boldly picked up the scalpel, only for the patient to lose his life due to a medical error. That patient was a man in his early 60s, and he had joked that he didn't want to die before holding his soon-to-be-born grandchild. I had volunteered to perform the surgery, determined to make that goal a reality for him. But I was denied that chance because of hospital politics, and the patient lost his life. These kinds of things shouldn't happen, but in reality, they often do. Doctors like me can't go against people like Dr. Taylor or his family, or the senior physicians. Sure, there are good hospitals out there, but the one I worked at was rife with corruption, where ordinary doctors were treated like disposable tools. As if that wasn't hard enough to bear, Dr. Taylor's son casually said, "Medical mistakes are inevitable." That was the moment my anger boiled over. Before I knew it, I was suspended and eventually encouraged to resign. The thought that I may never be allowed to hold a scalpel in Japan again filled me with a deep sense of frustration. My mother's gone, and I have no reason to stay here. With that, I left Japan and started a new life overseas. Fortunately, foreign hospitals didn't hold my past in Japan against me. In fact, they laughed, saying the hospital had lost a skilled surgeon, and comforted me. For over 10 years, I contributed to the medical field abroad. I performed surgeries, helped out in understaffed departments, and gave my all. But now, at 48, I'm exhausted. I've saved many lives, but what I can do is limited. Thinking about my mother and the patient who tragically lost his life, I finally burned out. I decided to spend the rest of my life back in Japan, my homeland. And that's how I ended up on this plane. Yet, fate doesn't seem to want to let me go. Please, someone. I slowly opened my eyes. I had only been lost in thought for a few seconds. The cabin was still in chaos. I asked a nearby flight attendant what was going on. She said that it seems like there was an emergency. The patient is a young Japanese girl who apparently suffers from a chronic condition, and her symptoms have flared up. The mother, who had been shouting earlier, was frantically searching for some sort of device but couldn't find it, leading to her panic. I started to understand the situation. The device she was searching for was likely for administering insulin or something similar. After so many years as a doctor, I could piece things together just from hearing the situation. Then, a man raised his hand. "I'm a doctor from Japan." Without hesitation, the young doctor, James, rushed over to the girl and her mother. I watched the scene unfold from my seat, a little distance away. "What's your daughter's name?" "Sophia." Her father is from Northern Europe, and like him, Sophia also has diabetes. When people think of diabetes, most associate it with adults. However, that's usually type 2 diabetes, which is linked to lifestyle. There's also type 1 diabetes, which affects younger people, including children. Insulin is produced by the pancreas's beta cells. But sometimes, due to a malfunction, T cells from the immune system start attacking these beta cells. The immune response creates inflammation in the pancreas, leading to the destruction of these cells, and eventually, insulin production stops. This is the mechanism behind type 1 diabetes. Genetics also play a role, and in Northern Europe, type 1 diabetes is particularly common, with nearly 1 in 2 patients being diagnosed with it. So it wasn't surprising that this young girl had type 1 diabetes. We usually use a pump to administer her insulin. But it looks like we forgot the pump and only brought the cartridge. That explained the mother's panic. If they had the right equipment, she could have calmly managed her daughter's condition. But having the insulin without the necessary device was useless. After more than 6 hours into the flight, the girl's condition was rapidly worsening, and if nothing was done soon, she could suffer multiple organ failure, putting her life in serious danger. Even if we made an emergency landing at the nearest airport, it would be a gamble whether she'd make it in time. Despite the desperate situation, James remained calm. There was a reason for his composure. That's a relief. I also have diabetes and always carry a pen injector. We can use this to administer insulin to Sophia. The atmosphere shifted as people cheered. James, though young, had quick judgment and solid skills, so I figured there was no need for me to step in. But then, a problem arose. Wait! It's not working. I glanced over again. James was trying repeatedly to get the needle to come out of the pen, but it wasn't working, and precious time was slipping away. The girl's complexion was worsening, and she was starting to lose consciousness. I could see the panic in James's eyes as his hands began to tremble. I took a deep breath. And I stood up slowly. Mind if I take that apart? James looked at me in disbelief as I suddenly appeared. But there was no time to wait for his response. I took the injector from his hand, quickly disassembled it, and saw exactly what I had suspected. The spring is broken. But we can fix this. Can someone lend me a ballpoint pen? I asked in both English and German, and people who understood immediately passed pens down to me in a relay. The flight attendants called out in multiple languages, and soon, even more pens came my way. With permission, I disassembled them to extract the springs inside. I only needed one that fit, and with this many, surely one would work. After working with that mindset for about a minute, I finally found the matching spring. If we just do this, look, the needle's coming out. I handed the pen injector back to James, who promptly administered the insulin to Sophia. The cabin fell silent, and the sound of everyone holding their breath filled the air. A few moments later, the girl slowly opened her eyes. A loud cheer and applause erupted throughout the cabin. Sophia's mother, tears welling up in her eyes, expressed her gratitude. I can't thank you enough. I exchanged a few words and then quietly left the scene. I had only helped a little, and I believed the young doctor who had first stepped up to save the girl deserved the real praise. Sophia's condition stabilized, and the remainder of the flight went smoothly, landing safely at Narita Airport without further incident. Whether it was because of the long trip or dealing with the trouble, I felt an unusual level of exhaustion as I tried to get off the plane, rolling my neck and shoulders. Then, I heard someone call out to me from behind. Thank you so much for what you did back there. It was the mother from earlier. No, I don't deserve any credit. It was the young doctor who rushed over. And the idea for fixing the pen came from a student in an article I read once. That was the truth. I couldn't remember when, but I had read about a similar situation where a patient was saved by a student using the same method. I only managed to handle it because I happened to notice it and remembered. I was able to disassemble the insulin syringe without difficulty simply because, as a doctor, I was familiar with how to use it. So, there was no reason for anyone to thank me. Still, she wasn't ready to let it go. Even so, without you, my daughter might not have survived. I wanted to thank you during the flight, but I was too worried about her. And we were sitting far away. As a fellow Japanese, I'm so proud of what you did. Please, let me thank you properly. She bowed deeply. By now, most of the passengers had disembarked, and we were starting to hold up the staff preparing to clean the cabin. Well, why don't we continue this at the airport lounge? I think they have some nice suites there, and your daughter can join us. When I said that, the mother's face lit up with relief. Later, as I waited in front of the lounge, the mother and daughter arrived. I already knew the girl's name was Sophia, but when the mother introduced herself, I was taken aback. My name is Kelly. Kelly, yes, she definitely said that. I can feel my heart pounding louder than usual. Kelly, could it be that Kelly? She looked at me in confusion. I knew this woman. She had been my first love. It's me. Eric. Her eyes widened, and she covered her mouth in shock. No way. Eric? Is it really you? Sophia watched us with a big smile. Kelly and I had met during college. I was in the medical school, and she was in the economics department. We wouldn't have crossed paths normally, but we were both in the canoe club. Clubs were pretty much the only way to interact with students from other departments. Kelly was like the sun. When she laughed, everyone around her smiled, and if there was any trouble in the club, she'd step in and smooth things over in no time. Everyone admired her. It was only a matter of time before I fell for her, and as we spent more time together through club activities, my feelings grew. But I was too much of a coward to confess, and 4 years passed without me ever telling her how I felt. Kelly graduated first, and over time, we drifted apart. By then, I was buried in clinical rotations and preparing for the national medical exams, so my social life dwindled even within the medical school. I barely interacted with anyone except close friends. I locked away my feelings for Kelly, stashing them in a drawer deep inside my heart, securely locking it shut. But standing in front of her now, I realized how futile that lock had been. Even after all these years, I still felt a faint spark of those old feelings. It's a bit awkward standing here, so let's go inside. Yes, let's. We awkwardly made small talk and sat down at a table in the lounge, the three of us. I had a friend working here who had arranged for some child-friendly sweets, like chocolate cake and shortcake, to be prepared in advance. I ordered a black coffee, while Kelly chose a café au lait with plenty of sugar and milk. After a brief, awkward silence, Sophia spoke up first. "Thank you for saving me, mister." Hearing those words from the daughter of the woman I once loved stirred emotions in me that were hard to describe. It was clear from Kelly's words on the plane, and the fact that she had a daughter, that she was already someone else's partner. So, I knew I had no right to feel this way. But when I looked into Sophia's eyes, I couldn't help but be reminded of the Kelly I once knew, the one I spent so many days with in the canoe club. "Sophia, can mommy talk with this man for a bit?" After saying that, Sophia nods with a smile and moves toward the counter with the plate of cake in hand. As my friend, the staff member, kept Sophia company, Kelly and I sat there in awkward silence, just staring at each other. "Well, it's been a long time. I never expected to run into you like this." Kelly gives me a gentle smile in response to my words. I'm surprised too. "It's been so long, Eric. What were you doing on that plane?" I hesitated, unsure of where to begin. If she were still the kind, understanding person I remembered, maybe she'd sympathize with my struggles. But what I did, though indirect, essentially left an important patient behind. And that means I ran away. Surely, kind-hearted Kelly would understand my struggles and hardships, and she would probably comfort me, saying it must have been tough. However, in front of Kelly, my unnecessary pride always got in the way, and I couldn't tell her the truth. I lived in Japan for a while, but things happened, and I ended up overseas. Now, I just figured it was time to return home for good. No deep reason. It wasn't a lie, but even so, I felt uneasy after saying it. Kelly's eyes took on a melancholic look as she gazed at me. "Eric, did you ever get married?" The emotions I had buried for so long began to flare up inside me. Then, like a wave crashing over me, the feelings came rushing back. Of course not. We never said anything back in college, but I always thought we were close. Remember when I asked you to the fireworks festival before you graduated? You never came. I took that as your answer. My voice was low and heavy, as if trying to suppress the anger and disappointment from all those years ago. Kelly flinched slightly, her shoulders trembling as she looked down, troubled. I wasn't just dealing with an unrequited crush. I had tried to express my feelings, but in the end, it all fell apart, leaving me scared to love again. That's why I've remained single to this day. But that was my issue, not Kelly's. She didn't simply stand me up that day. Her family had an emergency and she had to prioritize them. This was nothing more than me lashing out. I understood that logically. Yet, the trauma of my first love falling apart in an instant still haunted me, stirring confusing emotions I hadn't fully processed. I'm sorry. You made the right choice back then. Family is far more important than fireworks. I was a fourth-year medical student at the time. I should have known better. This is my problem, not yours. Eric. Kelly called after me, but I ignored her and rushed out of the lounge. At my age, I should know better than to act so immaturely, throwing a tantrum over a long-past heartbreak. We hadn't stayed in touch, and we hadn't exchanged contact information. If I left now, I might never see her again. But after revealing such ugly emotions, I couldn't imagine facing her again. I started to walk away, trying to push forward. But then, why is Sophia here? Oh, because we live here now. Fate, it seemed, had a cruel sense of humor. What kind of grudge did it hold against me? The apartment I had rented to spend the rest of my life in peace was right next to Kelly and Sophia's. I hadn't planned on socializing much with my neighbors, just offering polite greetings if we crossed paths. I certainly didn't expect my first encounter to be with Sophia, coming home from school with her backpack. Do you live here, mister? Yeah, I guess I do. Sophia, could you maybe not tell your mom about this? Don't worry, I won't say a thing. But in exchange, I want you to teach me something. As I wondered what she meant, Sophia pulled a thick book out of her backpack. It looked like something she had borrowed from the school library, filled with information about planets, galaxies, and the universe. A wave of nostalgia hit me. It was just like the encyclopedia my mother had bought me all those years ago. You know, I'm going to be a middle schooler soon. Since this is my first time going to a school in Japan, there's a lot I don't understand. But I love science. Can I ask you questions if I don't get something in this book? Mommy said you're really good with constellations and space stuff. It didn't surprise me that Kelly would remember my love for stargazing, something we'd shared during our time in the canoe club. But that was a story from decades ago. I can't believe she still remembers it. Sure, I'll help with whatever I can. When I said that, Sophia flashed an irresistible smile, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't help but see Kelly's face behind it, filling me with guilt. From that day on, Sophia and I began our secret lessons. Most planets don't have much water, right? So why does Earth have so much? Have you heard of comets? They're full of water and organic materials, the kind of stuff that's essential for life. Scientists think Earth's oceans were formed when comets with loads of water crashed into it a long, long time ago. As I spoke, Sophia scribbled notes in her notebook, switching between the encyclopedia and my explanations. I really wonder where this child's questions come from. At one point, I found myself seeing a bit of my younger self in her, and my heart skipped a beat. She's the child of someone I once loved, a complete stranger to me. Yet somehow, without even realizing it, I've grown close to Sophia, almost as if she weren't a stranger at all. The months flew by, and before I knew it, Sophia had grown into a responsible middle schooler. Dressed in her still loose sailor uniform, she started sharing her goals for the future. I want to join the science club. I've never been that strong, so I get out of breath easily when I exercise. And with type 1 diabetes, mommy worries when I push myself too hard. If I get stuck with any of the new schoolwork, can I still ask you for help? Sophia said this with a cheerful skip in her step as she headed off to school. Watching her leave, I spoke to the figure behind me without turning around. You figured out I was your neighbor, didn't you? Looking a little sheepish, Kelly stepped out from where she had been hiding. At first, I thought Sophia was meeting some stranger. But then I overheard her mention the name Eric, and when I asked the landlord, they told me the man next door was named Eric. I kept watching, and when I confirmed it was really you, I felt better. Thank you for teaching Sophia. She's had a hard time adjusting to school in Japan, and you've been a real support for her. I should apologize for sneaking around. But Sophia is such a diligent student. I don't think she'll have any trouble fitting in at school. Talking about Sophia brought an involuntary smile to my face. I realized that somewhere along the way, she had become more than just the neighbor's kid to me. She had become someone I deeply cared about. Then, Kelly changed the subject. What about after you graduated from medical school? You became a doctor, right? I mean, only someone with real experience could handle that insulin pen on the plane so easily. Of course, she would want to know. The truth was, I was just as curious about her life. As you guessed, I became a doctor after med school. But after years of exhaustion, I left Japan. Since then, I've led a pretty uneventful life. What about you? What happened to Sophia's father? I could tell by the way Kelly's face clouded over that this was a sensitive topic, and I regretted asking. Sorry, I shouldn't have asked. Forget I said anything. Kelly interrupted me, her voice firm. No, it's fine. I want to tell you everything, Eric. I've been carrying regrets ever since that fireworks festival. She began to speak, unraveling the memories that had remained frozen in time. That night, it was my father who was rushed to the hospital. He suddenly collapsed from a seizure, and my mother called an ambulance. I joined them at the hospital during his emergency surgery, praying he'd make it through. He survived, but there were complications. And for years after that, he was in and out of the hospital. He passed away recently because of that hospital's negligence. The brightness I had always associated with Kelly seemed to dim as she spoke, her voice now carrying a weight I never thought I'd hear from her. The name of a patient I had failed to save came rushing back to me. Edward. How do you know my father's name? I collapsed to my knees, the weight of realization hitting me like a ton of bricks. Edward, 61 years old. He was one of my patients, the man who lost his life because of the negligence of Dr. Taylor's son. No, this can't be happening. Edward was your father? I clutched my chest tightly. My breath becoming shallow as the memory of that day rushed back. My throat burned with the intensity of the guilt, the pain nearly unbearable. Kelly watches with a worried expression. Don't tell me your father was in charge of that? Are you involved in this? Confusion, then anger, flares up in Kelly's eyes. I can't say anything, standing there frozen as time slowly passes. It's as good as admitting it. But I also bear responsibility for not being able to stop Director Taylor's son from spiraling out of control. And a few months ago, I told Kelly that because her father collapsed on the night of the fireworks festival, I couldn't express my feelings to her. Regret overwhelms me now. No matter what Kelly says to me, I have to accept it all. I know that, yet my heart can't catch up with the reality. The awkward silence is suddenly broken by Sophia, who should have already left for school. "Mom," he tried to help Grandpa. Both of our gazes shift to Sophia. She lets out a small sigh and then returns to her room. After a while, she comes back holding something in her hands. "Grandpa gave this letter to Dad. He told Dad to keep it a secret from you and to give it to me instead. Now that I think about it, Edward used to write letters all the time. When I asked who they were for, he said they were for his grandchild. At that time, Edward's daughter, Kelly, had just moved abroad, married a local man, and was expecting a child. Maybe Edward, who had been in and out of the hospital for years, knew that his time was coming. Apparently, there was also a letter for you, Mom, but because you were so sad about Grandpa, Dad decided to give it to me instead. All of Grandpa's feelings are written in here." Sophia slowly begins to read the letter aloud. In it, Edward expressed a lot of gratitude toward me, his doctor. Sophia continues reading, her voice gentle. "Eric, who was Mom's friend, was my doctor. Mom liked Eric, but when Grandpa collapsed, she broke their date to rush to Grandpa's side. Grandpa regretted that. I felt guilty for interfering with Mom's first love and for having that very person end up as his doctor. Kelly, I'm so sorry." In that moment, Kelly collapses to the floor, sobbing. She cries openly, without regard for anyone around her, tears streaming down her face. I, too, feel a deep sense of helplessness. Edward had understood everything. He trusted me, even though I was only 36 at the time, saying he could entrust everything to me. But I couldn't save him. If only I had insisted on performing the surgery that day, maybe Edward could have met Sophia, the granddaughter he had been waiting for. I made an unforgivable mistake. And I ran away, trying to escape from the guilt. In the end, I caused nothing but pain for my first love. I don't know what to do anymore." Sophia softly breaks the silence. "Mom, I think Grandpa was happy. He had Eric, who he trusted, taking care of him, and even after he passed, there are people here crying for him. For the sake of Dad, who let you come back to Japan because it was what you wanted, you need to look forward." Kelly had told me she regretted avoiding me after that fireworks festival. She went on a trip abroad to escape reality, where she met Sophia's father, got married, and started a life overseas. She had been trying to forget me, and then, just when she was about to give birth to Sophia, she received the news of Edward's passing. I thought I was going to lose my mind. I couldn't forgive anyone involved with my father's death, not the hospital, not anyone. Almost 13 years have passed since then, and I've finally found some peace. I talked to my ex-husband, and I told him I wanted to come back to Japan. I couldn't rest until I avenged my father's death. He understood. He couldn't come to Japan because he's running his business there. But he still let me go. "What you want is what I want," he said. Even though we're divorced, I still love him. But after reading the letter and learning about Eric, all my thoughts of revenge disappeared. Kelly gives a bitter, self-deprecating laugh. She had been just like me. Let me apologize again for what happened to Edward. That day, I wasn't even allowed into the operating room. I was powerless. I couldn't stop thinking about him, and eventually, I fled overseas. But the words Edward said before he passed have never left my mind. Home is a good place. A month before the surgery was scheduled, Edward told me that. Even though his illness brought him a lot of suffering, he said that if he could spend his final moments in the land where he was born and raised, it would be worth it. Could I really allow myself to live out my life abroad, continuing to run away? With that thought in mind, I felt compelled to return to Japan, to Edward. Kelly, revenge doesn't suit you. But let me carry out your will. I think I've finally realized why I came back here. I wasn't just seeking peace. I kept telling myself that I couldn't keep running, trying to summon the courage to finally confront everything. I'm going to fight. Even though it happened 13 years ago, what we lost was too precious to be buried and forgotten. So, please, leave it to me. When I said that, Kelly looked at me with fierce determination, and she gripped my outstretched hand tightly. After that, I began digging through old records, contacting people who were involved, and gathering evidence. Eventually, I helped expose Dr. Taylor and his son. If it had been just about that one incident, it might have been swept under the rug. However, even after Edward, those two didn't learn their lesson and continued engaging in illegal and criminal activities. It was thanks to my efforts in reaching out to the right people that their embezzlement of hospital funds was exposed through a whistleblower. And in the end, both of them were arrested. Was this justice? I wasn't sure. Even with them behind bars, nothing could bring Edward back. But in some way, we were finally free from the time that had been frozen for so long. The fog that had clouded my heart lifted, and I felt a new sense of clarity and peace. See you later. Sophia, now in high school, was attending a science-focused school. She had decided she wanted to become an astronomer. It seems she's taken after you. But an astronomer, not a doctor? Kelly remarked with a smile. I think it's perfect. Right, Michael? It's only fitting for the daughter of someone who worked in astronomy. I called out to the tall man standing next to Kelly. Michael is Kelly's ex-husband, but it seems he couldn't stop worrying about his wife and child back in Japan. So he handed over his business to a successor and came here. At the time, they both seemed hesitant, so I had told them, "Why don't you just get remarried here?" I mean, what did Michael come all the way here for? Kelly, Michael is the man who gave up his job to follow you. You two are really hopeless, aren't you? Taking my advice, they bashfully registered their marriage again in Japan. I signed as a witness. Sometime later, Sophia and I were stargazing late at night, watching a meteor shower. As we stared up at the sky, she quietly said, "You're like a comet." Me? A comet? Yeah. Comets carry water and the building blocks of life, right? You saved me on that plane, brought my family back together, and helped Grandpa pass away without regrets. You're like the source of life for our family. She smiled warmly as she said it. But in my eyes, Sophia was the real comet. A bright, guiding light that brought everything full circle.